All right, welcome to Participles. I have given you this handout. This is the grammar summary from Wallace. So it's not the full analysis of participles, but it is the summary. I think it's good enough to work off of. Um, so let's talk about what we do when we come across participles. First of all, we have to decide if it's mostly, the way Wallace explains it is it mostly an adjective or is it mostly a verb? That's as good of a way of explaining it as any. So the first question is this participle being used mostly as an adjective? Now, the first thing to look for is an article. If the participle has an article, of course, the article should match it in gender number case. If the participle has an article, then it's an adjectival participle. The adjectival participle can be used in a couple of ways. It can be used attributively, just like adjectives can. So all of the ways that adjectives can modify nouns with article, adjective, noun, adjective, article, noun, all of those ways that an adjective can modify a noun, participles can do that too. A lot of times when a participle is used that way, we can translate it as who or which. Participles can also work just like predicates. So here you're not usually going to have an article, but if it's related to a noun, it's the same gender number case as a noun in the sentence, and it's not in one of those standard attributive um, constructions, you might suspect it's a predicate participle. Uh, Participles can also be used substantively. Here they are going to have an article. I'm going to say 99% of the time. There's always exceptions. But here's where you're going to get an article and a participle with no other nouns. And so here you're going to translate it something like the one who, if it's masculine, or the thing which, if it's neuter. Or the people who, if it's masculine plural. So that's the substantival use of the participle. Now, here's where I want to come to. The verbal participles are the ones that we sort of end up scratching our heads over the most. Here, these are where the verbal nature is emphasized over the adjectival. Now, in order to be a verbal participle, the participle can't have an article, and it should be in the nominative case. There might be some exceptions, but for the most part, when we're talking about the verbal participles, we're talking about a lot of the participles that we've already looked at, those participles that are either present tense or aorist and are masculine singular or masculine plural, and there's a subject in the sentence that they match up with in gender number case. So that's another way to kind of circling back, looking to figure out if the participle might be adjectival. If it's not nominative, then again, 99% of the time, it's going to be adjectival. Now, I've given you this handout. It goes through the dependent verbal participles. I'm going to show you that in a PowerPoint, but let me just scroll down to tell you there are a few others. We're going to discuss attendant circumstance, but when we get down here to indirect discourse, complementary participles, and the periphrastic use of participles, as well as independent verbal participles, I'm not going to cover those right now. So just be aware there's more stuff that we haven't learned. Hopefully Duff will get us to those eventually. If Duff doesn't take us there, don't worry. It's probably not something that occurs very often. So let me share with you now the PowerPoint to take you through these adverbial uses of the participle. Okay. So first, let's go through what these look like in English so we can start to sort of wrap our heads around what this is going to be like. Um, Participles in English, of course, have an ing at the end. So here's an example. Seeing his long lost son, the father ran out to meet him. Now, when we look at these adverbs, that sentence I just read to you, that's what a word for word translation from the Greek is going to look like. Seeing his long lost son, the father ran out to meet him. Or if it's an aorist participle, having seen his long lost son, the father ran out to meet him. But we can make some different decisions with these participles when we translate into English. And it helps us to think through the meaning of the Greek. So here are some examples. In this case, when we think about what's the relationship between the father seeing and the father running out, well, it seems to be a relationship of time. It seems to be here that the connection between the seeing and the running is just simply one of time. And if the connection is of time, then we can translate it with a dependent clause starting with, for example, when. When he saw his long lost son, the father ran out to meet him. Or after he had seen, if it's aorist, his long lost son, the father ran out to meet him. Now, notice that in this dependent clause in English, once we switch from a participle, which doesn't have a subject, seeing, to a finite verb, saw, which needs a subject, the subject is going to be the same subject as in the rest of the sentence. You sort of get that from the fact that it's a nominative participle. So, seeing his long lost son, the father. So, when he saw, meaning the father ran out to meet him. So let's look at a different one. Keeping a straight face, he related the most hilarious story. So again, this doesn't come from the Greek grammar. This comes through thinking about what's going on in this sentence and what's the relationship between the keeping and the relating. Well, this seems to be one of manner. Keeping a straight face is the way in which he related the most hilarious story. So we might say, keeping a straight face, he related the most hilarious story. But we're going to keep in mind, and we don't have a nice subordinate word to use in English for manner. Generally, when you find a participle of manner, we just leave it as a participle, keeping a straight face. And that's the way we translate it. But what's important to note is that this is manner, how he related the story. The next example is breaking the window, they rescued the trapped child. So here, the relationship between breaking and rescuing is that breaking the window is the means by which they rescued the trapped child. This is what they resorted to, so as to rescue the child. In English, we might translate this using by. By breaking the window, they rescued the child. Another relationship between the participle and the main verb could be one of cause. Knowing it was time to depart, he said his goodbyes. So here we might translate it, because he knew it was time to depart, he said his goodbyes. And again, notice that the subject of the dependent clause is the same he as the subject of the main clause. Another relationship is a relationship of result. At the end of a tumultuous life, he turned to God, obtaining the peace that had always eluded him. This is a little bit difficult to translate into English. Sometimes we can translate it as two sentences or separate them, create two finite verbs with and in between, two independent clauses is the technical terminology. At the end of a tumultuous life, he turned to God and thereby obtained. Sometimes it's easiest just to use and as a result. And as a result, he obtained the peace that had always eluded him. That way you keep the sense of a subordinate clause, but you also communicate this idea of result. Another relationship between the two is that of concession. So here is where we have some tension between what's going on in the participle and what's going on in the main verb. So doubting seriously the odds of winning, he nevertheless decided to place the bet. So here we could also translate it as, although he seriously doubted the odds of winning, he nevertheless decided to place the bet. So now that we've seen the ways that participles can also convey all of these different logical connections between the verb of the participle and the verb of the main verb. And the way that works in English, we're going to start moving into Greek. So first of all, I want to show you this chart again. I gave this to you earlier, but now we can sort of see it a little more fully. So again, when we have a participle and it's nominative and it matches up with the gender number case of the subject of the main sentence, then we have an adverbial participle. And we can look at this chart to try to think about what is the connection, the logical connection between the subordinate clause and the main clause. And the tense of the participle can give us a clue. Now, again, we still only know the aorist and the present participles, but this is where you can kind of see the way these tenses can possibly suggest logical connections. There's some overlap. It's not an absolute foolproof way, but if you're looking at a participle and you're struggling to think about what's the connection between this participle and the main verb, here's where, if you have an aorist participle, you might try these possibilities first and then go to means and manner. Sorry, you can't see my cursor. You might try these possibilities first and then move on to means and manner. If you have a present participle, you might try means and manner first and then try result and then maybe purpose. And when we get these other participles, that'll expand your possibilities. So then how do we translate? So the first way to translate is with an English participle. And depending on whether it's a present tense participle in Greek or an aorist participle in Greek, we're going to translate it so that we see the time factor related to the main verb. So for example, a present participle might be going, and the aorist version of the same participle would be having gone. Present participles get translated so that they express the same time as the main action. Now that's going to get tricky because when we have a present tense participle and an aorist or an imperfect main verb, that present participle is still communicating something that happened in the past. But what it's telling us is that it happened at the same time as this past event that the main clause is telling us about. If we have a future verb in the main clause and we have a present participle, that's still going to be telling us that the action of the participle happened at the same time as the action of the main verb, but all of it then happened in the future. And so the way we translate that into English might be different, even though it's expressing the same thing in Greek. An aorist participle tells us that the action of the participle happened at a time previous to the main action. So if the main verbs are imperfect or perfect, we're going to have to use a tense called the pluperfect in English. And that's where we get sort of having gone kinds of constructions so that we can make sure that we're pushing um, that event of the participle into a time previous to the past of the main clause. Whereas if the main clause is present or future, then as long as the dependent clause tells us it's sometimes previous, it doesn't have to be pushed back quite as far. Those are the relationships you should be thinking about as you think about the tenses of participles. Let's talk a little more about how we translate. We can translate just with a participle in English, but we can also translate, just like in the examples I showed you before in English, with a subordinate clause that starts with something like because, when, while, as. In this case, the verb is going to become finite, and the subject of the main clause will become the subject within the dependent clause. So for example, bouncing the ball, the boy ran down the street. If we're going to turn that into a subordinate clause, we're going to get as he bounced the ball, the boy ran down the street. And again, the tenses are going to change depending on the tense of the participle. This is translated as though the participle is present tense and the bouncing is happening at the same time as the running, and both are happening in the past. That's why this is past. If this was bouncing the ball, the boy runs down the street, then we would translate it as he bounces the ball, the boy runs down the street. And if the main verb was, or if the participle was aorist, it would be having bounced the ball, the boy ran down the street, and we would translate it after he bounced the ball, or after even he had bounced the ball, the boy ran down the street. The even was just me emphasizing to you, not part of the sentence. After he had bounced the ball, the boy ran down the street. Okay, so now we're ready to really look at the Greek. So let me give you some examples. Luke 24:17 says he asked them, what are you discussing together as you walk along? So peripatuntes, we have a present participle. It's in masculine plural form. It goes with the you of antibalete. And so we can translate it as time, walking along. What are you discussing together? Walking along. But we can also show very clearly that the idea here is one of time. At the same time as you walk along is the idea. We also have examples of cause, 2 Corinthians 3:12 and Acts 17:24. So echontes is probably a word you recognize. It's the present tense participle of echo. So having such a hope is the literal translation of the participle, but what we see here is that the relationship between having the hope and being bold is one of cause. And so we can express that in our translation. Therefore, since we have such a hope, we are very bold. Similarly, here we have the God who made the world, and notice that there's a participle right here, but this participle has an article, and we see that it's article, noun, article, adjective. So this is very clearly an adjectival participle, and so we're not going to follow any of these rules. We're going to follow the rules of an adjective, and we can also use who, what, or which to translate it. So the God who made the world is how the NIV translates it. And then and everything in it, because he is the Lord of heaven and earth. So being the Lord of heaven and earth, but gives the idea of cause. So we can translate it because he is the Lord of heaven and earth. He doesn't live in temples built by human hands. We have concession in Matthew 13:13 and Mark 8:8. This was kind of a nice, concise way to say it in Greek. Ble pontes hu ble pusin, kai akuontes uk akuusin. So though seeing, they don't see. Though hearing, they don't hear or understand. So literally would be seeing, they don't see, but we can express this idea of concession by adding the though. We can also, like I did here in Mark 8:18, add the same subject as from the main clause and change the participle to a finite verb. So we can say, though they have eyes, they don't see. Though they have ears, they don't hear or understand. We can also have a participle of manner, and they came bringing to him a paralyzed man. Like I said, Manner doesn't have a neat way of expressing that in English. So generally when it's manner, we just leave the participle the way it is. And they came bringing to him a paralyzed man, ferontes. And again, this is a present participle. If this were an aorist participle, we would have to express somehow that the bringing happened before the coming. So we would say, and they came having brought to him a paralyzed man. Condition, 1 Timothy 3:10, they first must be tested, and then if they are blameless. So we have the participle of ami here, ontes. So we could just say, sorry, and then being blameless. And then being blameless, let them serve as deacons. But what this really expresses is a condition, if they are blameless. And so we add that in our translation. Instrument or means, we have Luke 11:45. So, teacher, saying these things, you insult us also. So we have saying these things, but the saying these things is the way by which the teacher insults them. And so we can translate it in saying these things, or by saying these things might be even better. But note that not every translation agrees. Here we have the NIV that just brings out time. Teacher, when you say these things, you insult us also. So these are always going to be, there's always going to be differences. Again, lots of correct answers, some wrong answers too. Purpose, 1 Corinthians 4:14. I am writing this not to shame you, but to warn you as my dear children. So not shaming you is the Greek, but we're going to translate that as purpose. I write this not shaming you doesn't actually make a lot of sense in English. And so it's really important that we think about what's the relationship between the shaming and the writing. And it seems best expressed by purpose. I'm writing this not to shame you. And then we have result. Now, result and purpose are very similar. So it's really careful to think about the differences between those, right? Purpose is you want to achieve something. Result is you do achieve something. So there's a little bit of uncertainty in the idea of purpose, and it's pushed into the future, whereas a result is something that is either already happened, or it's something that's pretty certain is going to happen, the result. So they want to marry. Thelusin should be familiar to you. So they want to marry. Um, having judgment. So we would say bringing judgment. Bringing judgment because they have broken their first pledge would be sort of the word for word translation. But what's the relationship between the bringing and the wanting to marry? Well, this would be a result. A result of them marrying would be that they bring judgment on themselves. Now here, the NIV just starts a whole new sentence. We could also translate it, they want to marry with the result of bringing judgment on themselves, and just go ahead and put the word result right in the translation. Now, the last kind of participle that I want to tell you about is attendant circumstance. Attendant circumstance is kind of in a category all on its own, and I want to be careful that we don't start translating all participles this way, because there are some clear rules about it. This is from Daniel Wallace. And here are the 5 rules that make you think, ooh, this might be attendant circumstance. And let me just, attendant circumstance just means a thing that happens right nearby. In English, when a lot of things are happening quickly, we often put and he went to the store and he bought a piece of loaf of bread and he paid the cashier and he walked out the door and he walked down the street and he met his best friend, and we put all these ands next to each other. Greek uses participles for that. And so again, this is a matter of thinking about the way Greek works and translating it into the way English works. So Um, yeah, uh, that's the idea of attendant circumstance. The Greek will say this, English will say this and this, and the two things happened one after the other, even though the verbs are in the same tense. But Greek uses a participle for that. So suspect that a participle might be translated as an attendant circumstance if the tense of the participle is aorist, the tense of the main verb is aorist, the mood of the main verb is imperative or indicative, the participle in the Greek word order comes first. And also, the event of the participle happened before the event of the main verb. Now, usually they happen just one right after the other, but still, the event of the participle should happen before the main verb. And also, like I said, word order. The participle should come before the main verb. Now, this usually happens in narrative literature. Again, this is about telling a story. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. And in English, we put then or and in between them, and Greek uses participles for that. So let me give you an example. We have Acts 3:4, where Peter looked straight at him and said, "Look at us." Well, what this says in Greek is Peter looking at him said, and we can see this is an aorist participle. The main verb is aorist. Clearly, he looked before he said it, but he looked right before he said it. And so, where Greek says, looking straight at him, Peter said, English says, Peter looked straight at him and said, and so they go together. And so what happens here, the way you translate it is you just like we took participles before and turned them into finite verbs, you do that here, but there's no subordinate word. There's no because or as or while. You just turn it into a main clause. Peter looked straight at him, and then before the actual main verb you add the word and that's the way you do that in English. One more thing I wanted to mention is that it's not always easy to categorize these participles. Matthew 12:34, how can you, being evil, say anything good? Um, Being evil isn't exactly the cause of saying something good. That doesn't quite work. The NIV sort of gets around it by translating you who are evil. How can you who are evil say anything good? That works. The CEV says it's time. How can you, while you are evil, say anything good? And that interestingly leaves open the possibility that maybe someday they won't be evil and can say something good, which I think is kind of helpful. But again, these are things that we can debate. It's not always easy to categorize them. When you do your homework, if you choose to not translate a participle with a participle in English, I'd like you to put in parentheses what it is you're doing. Just put in parentheses participle time, put in parentheses attendant circumstance, put in parentheses concessive, whatever it is, but only do that for adverbial participles. So only nominative participles that match the subject of the main verb in gender number case. All right, I will see you in class. Send me an email or a WhatsApp or a forum question if any of these things are confusing. Again, this is where the saying really comes true. If you understand Greek participles, you understand Greek. Thanks for listening. Bye.